In 1925, the Holmes Book Company constructs its own building on 14th Street in downtown Oakland, which becomes their headquarters, but they continue to maintain a shop in San Francisco at 156 Kearny and later 223rd Street. After almost 3 years of learning the book trade at John Howell Books, David McGee sets off on his own and opens up a shop just up the street from Howell's at 480 Post Street. McGee was, according to James Hart, quote, a charming fellow, one of the sweetest, most easygoing, humorous, lively people I have ever known. And David McGee became a legend because he, like the best of his predecessors and contemporaries, did many things. He was a publisher, a bibliographer, and an author. Famous collections passed through his shop, and he was heavily engaged in the local book community here at the Book Club of California and with the Roxborough Club. And he remained in the trade for decades. And these wonderful catalogs, you get the sense of humor. Here's the scribe getting tired of this book, which he throws on the floor. And here's his Grabhorn Press bibliography. David McGee enjoyed himself, and indeed he was a wit. He once said that, quote, the antiquarian book business is a very enjoyable way of making very little money. Here's his moving announcement when he's doing this is great stuff. McDonald's Bookshop, J.A. McDonald, opens in 1928 at 76 6th Street. This is a slightly different, later location, the only ticket I could find. But McDonald is the first bookseller to use the Union label on his book ticket. In San Francisco, that book ticket. In 1930 appears a Civic Center bookstore at 1292 Market Street, owned by a Mr. Tomanowski, according to James Hart, who spoke very highly of the store. Now, these guys were in business until the 1940s, and they advertised quite heavily in the yellow pages and places like that. And here's another bookshop near there, utility bookshop. Here's a cult bookstore. Rare, 5,000 rare books on philosophy. You can even rent the book at 10% of the cost. That's great. Now here's one that's great. The Night Bookstore, this is a moving car, so we've just gone to a new place. It's September 1st, 1930. We'll be selling rare books, first editions. Store hours are from 4 to 10 p.m., Saturdays from 1 to 10 p.m. Below that it says, come and spend an evening. There's no other trace of the Night Bookstore that I can find anywhere else. In 1932, with business struggling during the Depression, John Howell told his son Warren that he's needed in the book business. And Warren R. Howell left Stanford University 2 years before he was to graduate to come to work at John Howell Books. Years later, he said that was the best thing that ever happened to him. Also, in 1932, George Fields, bookseller and publisher, opens a shop at 1419 Polk Street, and here is his first catalog, issued in 1935, printed by the Grabhorn Press. James Hart visited Fields' bookstore on many occasions, which he described as an attractive shop where, quote, it was a pleasure to visit and gossip about literary and bibliophilic affairs, and perhaps run into Oscar Lewis or Bob Grabhorn. Miraculously, Fields' bookshop still exists at 1419 Polk Street, and they kindly supplied me with this photograph of George and Carmen Fields in the old days. It is now a specialist in soulful and scholarly books from the worlds of spiritual traditions, and I heard recently that it is for sale. In 1934, A.M. Robertson dies, and no one continues his publishing and bookselling business. Gilbert Lilienthal buy out the Robertson inventory, and Robertson's handsome store at 222 Stockton Street closes. In 1937, a very colorful character enters the antiquarian book trade in Northern California. William P. Reedon. Bill Reedon was in the same class as Warren Howell at Stanford, but he was able to finish. 3 years later, and after having worked at a bank, Bill Reedon was persuaded by Los Angeles bookseller Jake Zeitlin and Stanford librarian Nathan Van Patten that his skills would be better applied to the antiquarian book trade. He followed their advice, and he followed the examples of other prominent booksellers before them. Over time, Reedon became a prolific producer of catalogs, a buyer and seller of large and notable collections and archives. He published books, and he did it all with a flair that was specially his. Bill Reedon, like Patrick Joseph Healy before him, appreciated the importance of pamphlet material, and Bill Reedon extended that appreciation to a field that had pretty much been ignored by American antiquarian booksellers, trade catalogs, and ephemera. Bill Reedon first had a shop, so his first catalog, which he started with catalog number 11, but that's his first catalog. Bill Reedon first had a shop at a couple of different locations in Burlingame, then Palo Alto, and for a few years he had a branch at 442 Post Street when William P. Reedon took over David McGee's downtown location. Reedon did not have as many employees come through his firm as Howell did, but of the notable ones that did work for Bill was one Carl Zamboni, a fine bookman and cataloger. Reedon's enormous basement at his home in Atherton was also a legendary hunting ground for booksellers and librarians. Here, Bill Reedon's doing a book with the Grabhorn Press, a Rabelais Thursday book. And there's Carl Zamboni. In 1941, the Argonaut Bookshop opens up on Kearney Street, a general antiquarian and secondhand bookshop that specialized in books material about the West, which it still does today, under the stewardship of the founder's son, Robert Haynes. Right here with us. Albeit in a different location up on Sutter Street. Argonaut is well known for many things, but certainly one of its greatest achievements was when it was in 1958, when it was used as one of the settings for Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo. And these pictures are Robert Haynes and his partner, Robert Rose. Here's the third catalog of the Argonaut Bookshop. I told Bob Haynes that I wanted to order that if he still had it. He laughed at me. Here's catalog number 6. In 1946, Henry Evans and his wife Patricia opened the Porpoise Bookshop at 628 Montgomery Street in the Monkey Block, as it was affectionately called. That's now the location of the Transamerican Building. That year, Evans also bought out the inventory of William McDewitt, who retired from shopkeeping when his lease at the enormous room on Sutter Street was not renewed. Evans was a writer, publisher, bookseller, printer, and self-styled bohemian. In 1949, he published a Washington hand press, and his imprint, the Peregrine Press, was born. I think at heart, Evans was first a printer, book and print maker, and then a bookseller. He was also fairly well known today for the fine botanical prints that he continued to produce after he closed the Porpoise Bookshop, then on Clement Street, in the early 1960s. And he did a guide to rare books right when he went into business. This is a very good book. I have a copy of it. It's a very interesting book. He did these little pamphlets, Bohemian San Francisco. Yeah, that's a lot of fun. Great reading. Here's a catalog for poetry that he did to come. And this is another book he did. Very interesting guy. A footnote to his career. On May 9th, 1950, the San Francisco police raided Evans' bookstore, then at 1157 Sutter Street, to confiscate works by Henry Miller. In 1946, Lou Langfield and Barbara Thompson opened a bookstore at the Fairmont Hotel on Nob Hill called Books Incorporated. You will hear a little more about Books Incorporated, which continues to this day, but only as a new bookstore. On April Fool's 1946, another bookshop enters the scene, the Caveat Bookshop at 450 and a half Sutter Street. Interesting and unusual, for it is San Francisco's first, and I think only, imaginary antiquarian bookshop that produced a catalog. The spoof was the work of Francis Farquhar and the Grabhorns. The emergence of the Caveat Bookshop is sound evidence that the trade in general was following the example set by David McGee in having a good time. And I'm sure that David McGee had a hand somewhere in this spoof. Here's an entry for Cook's Voyages. The usual 8 volumes in Atlas, all first editions, quarto, bound in spotted calf, plates immaculate, and then below that says, good cooks are increasingly hard to find in this state. Here's a description for a Dante Ashendene. To hell with Dante. At about the same time is a candid shot. Here's some other guys having a good time. This is a publisher's rep from Knopf with Harold Holmes, John Newbegin, and Paul Elder. So here is catalog number 1 of Irving Eidenmuller's El Dorado bookstore at 309 Kearney Street, issued in 1948. Eidenberg specialized mostly in modern literature. Around 1960, when El Dorado moved out to Clement Street, his shop was the favorite haunt for a young book scout from Berkeley named Peter B. Howard, who was just beginning his book education. In 1948, Leon Gilbert of Gilbert Lilienthal dies, and Books Inc. moves into 336 Sutter Street and merges with Gilbert Lilienthal, soon after Ted Lilienthal retires. Within 10 years, Books Incorporated would become a large book business with 2 branches in San Francisco, 1 in Seattle, Beverly Hills, and Albuquerque. But again, they had sort of moved into being mostly new booksellers, but I remember Books Inc. on Powell Street having a used book department well into the late 70s. In 1949, the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America is founded, and prominent dealers from both Northern and Southern California take an active role in its organization. And that's the list of all the members, the original members. Here is a poster announcing a series of talks at the San Francisco Public Library, handsomely printed by Henry Evans and his Peregrine Press. Within a decade, the ABAA will be organizing the first antiquarian book fairs in America. In 1950, John Howell retires from active bookselling, and Warren Howell takes over John Howell Books. A few years later, Warren Howell hires a young school teacher named John Swingle to come work for him as a cataloger. And here's some of the photographs from John Howell Books in that period. It really did become this wonderful place that we all begin to know and love. In 1957, the Holmes Book Company hires a young man to come work in its rare book room at its Oakland headquarters, a graduate of Black Mountain College in North Carolina named Robert Hawley. Bob works for Holmes for 20 years. And here's Bob with the book buyer from Holmes, Fred Moore, standing outside a branch they opened temporarily in the Kaiser building on Lake Merritt.